Hello and welcome to The Exchange. A special guest joined us a short while ago to discuss some of the developments in the war in the Middle East. He is Ambassador John Bolton, former National Security Advisor for US President Donald Trump during his first term. Now, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio from the very beginning said that about a planned Israeli action against Iran prompted the US strikes. And now, almost a month down the line, what's your reading about it? And especially with Tulsi Gabbard, the director of the US National Intelligence, saying that there was no intel suggesting that Iran was planning an attack.
Well, I think the combined operation between Israel and the United States was planned well in advance. I think the past 27 days have shown how good that planning was, how effective the military strike is against Iran's forces and against its nuclear and ballistic missile programs. I don't think we had to wait for an imminent threat because the risk of Iran getting nuclear weapons, which has been a real threat for quite some time, could appear without our knowing about it very quickly. So I think we're fully justified in conducting a preventative war, which is at least part of what's being accomplished now, I hope.
Ambassador, there's a notion that Israel is deliberately destabilizing the Middle East with a greater economic strategy and land acquisition as a part of the Greater Israel Plan. Do you subscribe to that?
No, I don't. I think it's clear from the exchange of full diplomatic relations between the United Arab Emirates and Israel, between Bahrain and Israel, that what Israel wants is partnerships in the Middle East so that the region can be developed. The problem with any progress in the Middle East is the regime in Iran. And as long as the Islamic Revolution is in control and pursuing nuclear weapons and continuing to support international terrorism, and now threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz, actually closing it now, but being a threat at any time to do it, any real chances for peace and stability don't exist. So I think that's what's at issue here. It's a problem not just for Israel, but for all the Gulf Arab states as well.
And how do you read President Trump's attitude towards the NATO allies?
Well, he's been very inconsistent and I think unfairly critical of the NATO allies. What he should have done before the war began was consult more broadly with allies, not to indicate what the military operation would be or when it would be, but to lay the groundwork for the necessary cooperation, again, not just with NATO allies, with the Gulf Arab states, with our friends in South Asia and East Asia, and he just didn't do that.
The US and Israel, or even NATO, is to keep Hormuz open. What would it entail?
Well, I think it's got to include preventing Iran from mining the strait, and preventing threats to the tankers and their military escorts by anti-ship missiles, swarms of fast boats, or whatever other technique Iran might try. People have to have confidence that these tankers carrying huge cargoes of oil can move through the Persian Gulf and out the Strait of Hormuz safely.
Is boots on the ground outlandish thought or a real possibility?
Well, I can't speak for what Trump may try and do. I don't think there's a need to take Karg Island, the main Iranian lift facility, to move oil onto these tankers. I think you can block the Strait of Hormuz to make sure no Iranian oil leaves. There could well be a need for boots on the ground to secure the nuclear facilities, the key nuclear facilities at Natanz and Esfahan and Fordo, because the nuclear threat is the gravest, and we don't want that enriched uranium or centrifuges or other material or information relating to the nuclear program to fall into the wrong hands, into terrorist hands or into the hands of another rogue state that wants a nuclear weapon.
Recently in Parliament, our President Anur Kumar Dissanayake, said that the United States requested 2 fighter jets to be landed at our southern airport, Mattala Rajapaksa International Airport, but the government denied access. That's what he said in Parliament, and the United States is yet to make an official response about it. But we have a question. The question is, when the war is in the Middle East, why does the US really try to land 2 of its jets at our airport when there is already a carrier in the Middle East positioned?
Well, some airplanes, of course, can't land on the deck of a carrier because the carrier is too small. So I'd have to know more about it. I would say that we've seen from Iran two missiles fired at the Diego Garcia joint U.S.-UK base in the middle of the Indian Ocean. So it just shows that really the war extends beyond the Middle East, and particularly the Iranian Navy and its naval capabilities, which could be used by the Ayatollahs to block the Strait of Hormuz, are legitimate targets when you're in this kind of situation.
The Gulf countries had relied on US for security, and now they are under attack from Iran due to US bases and assets in the region, triggering a slide in confidence among investors in those countries. So how this should be handled in your view?
Well, I think the Gulf Arab countries are showing increasingly that they want the United States to finish the job in Iran, and that what seemed to be a regime change objective at the beginning has been somewhat confused. But I think the ambassador of the United Arab Emirates to Washington has an op-ed in today's Washington Post basically saying, New York Times, I guess, saying basically that it's important that there be a complete resolution of this Iranian threat, which sounds to me a lot like saying regime change.
Ambassador Bolton, we're just curious to know, were you in those conversations before the US launching an attacks towards Iran? Were you even a part of those conversations?
No, I was not. I was very surprised that Trump did this, since in his first term, when I worked for him, he was against regime change in Iran. And I can't explain what changed his mind, but I hope he's thought through all the implications, all the questions that need to be answered to make this a successful operation.
Iran has people that has endured across time and is resolute. And is a deal likely, and or would Iran just keep going until all hostilities cease?
Well, I'd be very surprised if there's a ceasefire agreement anytime soon. I think the regime believes it simply has to survive before Trump's attention span wanders. And I think that's one reason why it's important that we're helping the opposition inside Iran. I don't detect any sign that we are. It would be a big mistake if we're not.
Ambassador Bolton, my final question for you. Do you actually think that there is an exit strategy from President Trump? Or is an exit strategy even possible the way things are going?
Well, he always has an exit strategy by simply declaring victory. I don't think he can do that with the Strait of Hormuz closed, but if it were open, I could see that. The strategy should have been thought out in advance. You don't think up your strategy on the 27th day of the war. That's clear. And if the objective was regime change, it should have been planned out thoroughly, because you don't want a wounded regime in Tehran that will simply rebuild back to the same level of threat that it was a month ago, which would mean this whole effort had been wasted. That would be a real tragedy.
Right. And thank you very much, Ambassador Bolton. And that's all the time we got. And thank you once again for sharing your views about the war in the Middle East. Thank you very much. That was quite
Well, thank you very much for having me.